the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically it was 100 per 100,000, now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do.
In these other states, by the way, you get shipped across the country, you get shipped to a rural area, and then if you want to keep in contact, people oftentimes can't make in-person visits. And what is the main form of contact? Telephones. And what happens when people are making these calls, and how much does it cost? It's extremely expensive. It's a racket, basically. I know myself, all of a sudden I've been getting these telemarketing calls saying, oh, there's an incoming call from a prison, and accept it. Of course, I'm not accepting these calls. So it seems as if everything is done possible to try to keep people away from their loved ones and support. And think if you have a parent who's incarcerated, and you never get to see that person. That relationship can be broken. It's hard to facilitate that relationship. And think of, as it said in that very first video, we end up with sometimes generational incarceration. It's not that it's inherited, but the likelihood does increase. So, let's see here. There we go, a little lag there. So for those who happen to go to the UU church I go to, the one in Falston, I unfortunately don't know the source of this, but in one of our sermons a few weeks ago, the topic of mass incarceration came up. As soon as I went to my Facebook feed right after that sermon, this popped up. Someone was attending a session that day, a presentation, and they took a snapshot. And what it was these are 2 defendants with the same crime, but what's the difference? So we have Chase Legleitner, armed robbery at age 19, pleaded no contest. The total points he received was 138.2. On the right, we have Lamar Boyd, armed robbery at 21, also pleaded no contest. Total points, 138.2. But look at the difference here. 2 years in county jail versus 26 years in prison. That's a big issue. Harford County. So if I asked what is, when you think in Harford County, who do you think is the typical substance user or substance abuser in our county?
White man.
Now, that is the case, right? But come on, if we were talking 5 years ago, 7 years ago, before the opioid epidemic, would that have changed? Yes, substantially, right? So with that in mind, here's a couple things. So this was from 2013. This was from an ACLU report here in Harford County. It was actually across the nation, but it said that blacks were arrested nearly twice as much as whites for pot in Harford County. And they went a step further and identified which towns we were talking about: Havertide, Aberdeen, Jopletown, Edgewood. No surprises there for many of us who live here. Well, but then I remember in 2016 there was this big headline. Police in Harford charged 2 in connection with Joppa pot distribution operation. It was like a $1.5 million operation. So with what I've just said, if blacks are arrested more likely than whites, 2 times as likely, who would you have assumed those people to be for $1.5 million? African American, right? No, thought they were white. Okay. Yes, they were indeed white, right? But then last year what we saw was, yes, those of you who said this the first time was, but the majority of Harford heroin overdose victims are white males between the ages of 25 and 35, concentrated in areas like Bel Air, Forest Hill, not what we previously would have referred to as the Route 40 corridor. There's a disconnect here. What's going on? So here's partially what's going on. Marijuana arrests in the entire state of Maryland. So blacks are 2.9 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana. Yet we're talking about decriminalization in Maryland. Does this apply to all people equally? No. Not at all. We're also talking about medical marijuana in our state. Who has licenses to distribute, the dispensaries, etc. And as many of you have been following, there's a huge disparity there. When they originally issued the contracts, there were no minority-owned dispensaries, and they hired a study, a consultant, etc. They're trying to get there, hasn't happened yet. So we actually, the state of Maryland, we are in the top 5 of states that spend money on enforcement against marijuana. in the entire country. Tons of money, yes. And basically, we look terrible in all the figures, so we're not doing well. And I think specifically here in Harford County, when I heard that human story of the district attorney who had been in office for 30 years, I see Carlos is here, he handed it. So what ours has been in office, what, 40-something years, 42, 44 years, right? And is anti-decriminalization of marijuana, and has actually stepped up enforcement. So some data, and you've already seen some of this, but sometimes it just has to hit you. So yes, we know the U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and it surpasses some of the most repressive regimes, whether we're talking Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. In Germany, we have 93 people incarcerated for every 100,000 adults and children, versus in the U.S., around 750 per 100,000. That's 8 times the rate. Or due to the drug war, over the past 30 years, our prison population, as they showed in those different graphics, has exploded from, what was that, 300,000 to 2.2 million, or 1 in 100 people, an increase of over 500%. What are we doing wrong here? So I was able to find some more recent data, but the reason why I kept this 2012 data is because I have this slide titled U.S. correctional population. So people just think of only those who are in prisons, and that's not the only people we're including here. So in 2012, our total correctional population, and what this means is those who are on probation, on parole, local jails, state prisons, federal prisons, all who are in either the custody of state or federal facilities, totaled almost 7 million people. That's 1 in 35 U.S. adults, or almost 3% of the U.S. adult resident population. So almost 4 million were on supervised community probation, almost 900,000 on parole, around 1.35 million people were incarcerated in state prisons, because I think people think federal over state sometimes. A little over 200,000 in federal prisons, and about 750,000 in local jails. We have a Harford County Detention Center here. Think of how many people are detained there currently. We have the state prison in Jessup, right? So think of the other places that we have here in Maryland. But this is, I think, is why most of us here are here. The racial composition of mass incarceration is its most striking feature, and that's what 13th was pointing out. That's what the new Jim Crow was pointing out. There was the quote talking about, yes, the end of slavery in the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, but not if you're incarcerated. Doesn't apply to you at all. So we actually imprison a larger percentage of our black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. Keep that in perspective. And in Washington, D.C., and right down the road in Baltimore City, 3 out of 4 black men is expected to serve time in prison. And in some major cities, up to 80% of black men have a criminal record, which perpetuates both poverty and the underclass. People want to try to say it's biological or it's inherent, etc. Well, think of such discriminatory policies as stop and frisk. Where do we stop and frisk people? Easier to stop and frisk people in Baltimore City than it is in Bel Air, right? Not likely to happen. Delaney and I were talking about this before this started. If you are looking for something, if you have your eyes focused on a particular community, of course you're going to find issues. How many people read the crime blogger in the Aegis? I read it online, and man, if I read that on a regular basis, in my mind, man, there is so much crime going on in Edgewood and Joppatown and Havre and Aberdeen. You know, and yeah, occasionally stuff pops up in Forest Hill or Falls State or here and there. It's not that crimes aren't happening. There's a difference between what happens and what is reported, and that's something we all have to keep in mind. So this topic, women in prison. You don't oftentimes think about this. So this is, again, slightly dated, but as far as this was in prison, 67,000 total women, but the majority of them were mothers. So think of the children who were affected. So of these 67,000 women, almost all of them had children, almost 150,000 minor children. Prior to prison, those children lived with their mothers. The alternative is that after the mother was imprisoned, those children were put in foster care. Think of how we are destroying families and tearing them apart. And then the cost. We've all heard about, we could be sending kids to college. We just were talking about, right before this meeting started, school resource officers. Should we put our money there? We should put them in with social workers, mental health workers, psychologists, etc. Cost of incarcerating one inmate, somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 a year. So it costs taxpayers, and that's from 2012, so I'm sure these numbers have gone up. At this point, that was $63.4 billion per year. Now, it did mention in one of the video clips about the private prison industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar business per year business. The Corrections Corporation of America happens to be the largest with 60 facilities across the U.S. One thing you might find interesting is that Thurgood Marshall, the late great Thurgood Marshall, at one point his son actually served on their board. So Thurgood Marshall probably is rotisserie in his grave if you knew that. However, it's an important point to note, and thank you for pointing this out, we don't have any private prisons here in Maryland. Now, where they're largely concentrated are places in the South and some of these Midwestern rural areas, but not here in Maryland, thankfully.
I think I just heard the cost of incarcerating one inmate is, currently the cost of incarcerating one inmate is more than it costs for a year at Harvard.
Right, so where do we want to spend our funds? Education or prisons? And I'm sure many of you have heard that saying, and this came up in our school to prison pipeline discussion, that based upon the number of children who are not reading at grade level in 3rd grade, that people decide how and where to build prisons. So where are our priorities? Education or incarceration? Now, this one is interesting. This is a little bit dated, but this is talking about racial disparities in the war on drugs. So here in the state of Maryland, we happen to rank number 1. This is not an area we want to rank number 1, and I'll explain why. What this is talking about is how states rank by their percentage of black drug offenders admitted to state prison. The reason why this is not a place to rank number 1 is that the black population in the state of Maryland in 2000 was 27%, a little over 3% now, but blacks were 90% of drug admissions to prison. That's a huge problem, huge problem. And then, you can't see this, but what it's showing is, I'll just tell you what it says. What it says is that it ranked all 50 states, and even if you were a state with a minuscule black population, if you were a black person in that state, think of places like Maine, Idaho, you were still far more likely to go to prison. Remember what I said, if we're shining a light on a group, of course you're gonna find something, right? And when we assume that only certain groups are more likely to commit certain crimes, that's who we're gonna focus on. I could have bored you with slides of data since we're talking about the war on drugs. So because of these numbers is the assumption that, oh my gosh, blacks are much more likely to use and abuse drugs, right? That's how people interpret this data. So when we look at all the various public health data out there, from the CDC, the behavioral risk factors surveillance study, the studies that our students who are in high school fill out every year, what we see is that blacks and whites use and abuse drugs at about equal amounts. But that's not what this data shows. What it shows is certain groups are targeted for enforcement. When I think of enforcement, I was I've been a college professor twice, once in a school of public health, once at a liberal arts college. If we want to talk about people who are using and abusing drugs, go to a residence hall at a private college. Are we enforcing there? Absolutely not, right? Because that's not the demographic that we're targeting. But it's easier to go to Edgewood or go to Baltimore City, catch someone on the street with a nickel bag, or haven't even talked about the disproportionate sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. And even though there have been laws to try to ameliorate this, the damage has already been done. So, one thing in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she talks about felony disenfranchisement and social exclusion. And so there are things such as if you have been labeled as a felon, employment discrimination, the box that we have. And I'll talk about being the box in a second, actually. But there is a question. Have you ever been convicted of a crime? Has it been a felony, a misdemeanor, whatever it may be? So even if it is a misdemeanor, that can prevent you from getting a job. Housing discrimination. People are not eligible for Section 8 housing if they're felons. Denial of the right to vote. And here in Maryland, that is not the case. We actually do allow felons in the state to vote. Many felons are not aware that they're able to, so I've seen education campaigns about that. But in many states. So think about this. I've just shown you these numbers. Think of the number of people in the black community who are labeled felons, who then cannot vote. That is a major issue, problem. Denial of educational opportunity. Are not eligible for Pell Grants and financial aid. Denial of food stamps and other public benefits. So if you need something supplemental nutrition or SNAP benefits, you're not eligible. And then lastly, exclusion from jury service. What this reminds me of, this is like you've done your time. Why do you now have a scarlet letter on you for the rest of your life? Right? They're going to punish you for the rest of your life. And now that all the cards are stacked against you when you come out, when you can't succeed and you may end up back in the system, we blame you, right? We've done nothing to help you, right? Yes.
Doesn't it
Sahar.
go
Yeah,
back-
let me give Sahar the mic. Go ahead.
I just have this issue, and it's in, I don't know, I grew up in a household where this was not the case, but I view people being sent to prison as a rehabilitation thing, you know, college, and I know, but, you know, it's like you said, we send these people right back out, whereas if they were rehabilitated, if they were allowed to maybe get their GEDs or things like that, you know, how would that change? And it's so disturbing to me as a liberal thinking person that we do this to people, and especially people of color. It just very much disturbs me that it's punitive and it's not rehabilitative.
Right. Of course, whether it's education, whether it's substance abuse treatment, whatever the case may be. And even if people do get that training, by the way, while they're in prison, when they come out, the cards are still stacked against them.
Because of the punitive actions taken against
Because
them
of these punitive
after
actions.
they serve their time.
Thank you.
After you're convicted and you serve your time, that should be your payback to society.
Right.
Why should there be, especially like denial of the right to vote?
Right, absolutely. So it's very punitive in nature, which is very different from the criminal justice systems in many other countries, which are much more rehabilitative in nature. So we have Maryland drug courts in Maryland. So what's interesting about this is who gets diverted to drug court versus regular court. There's prosecutorial discretion, who's going to get a plea deal. In the case of in Louisiana, where they're talking about McKinley, who's done the 17 years, oftentimes they might be innocent, but just to get out of prison or just to get out of being incarcerated, they will say they did it, knowing they're going to serve X number of years, not realizing what's going to happen when they get out. So that's a huge issue. We also have Harford County Teen Courts. This has been around since 2010, and I am dying to see data, so if anyone has any data on this, I would love to know. I know, Benita, you probably know something about this, because the issue is this is intended for first-time misdemeanor youth offenders, so that they can restore, so that restorative justice that we've been talking about within their communities, and then provide them the resources to improve their future decision-making. That's fantastic, but are all of our youth given that same opportunity? Does this go back to who we value and who we don't value? You know, think back to that picture, the two individuals, right? Did they have the same opportunity for justice or not? And that's why I want to see some data for this, because those kinds of things, they're great if they're equitable in how they are applied. So ban the box. I wanted to talk about ban the box for a second, because it's been very interesting. That box I mentioned, it's on job applications, it's on college applications. So there have been ban the box initiatives. Several states and local jurisdictions have passed ban the box on employment. Here in Maryland we have, and I think we're going to talk about it a little bit more, Phil, on employment applications, federal contractors. There also was one that was passed during the legislative session last year about removing it from the Maryland college applications. There is the Common App, which is a national application, but on Maryland-based college applications, removing that. Unfortunately, last year, our governor vetoed that, but thankfully, in January, that veto was overturned. And with that in mind, what I wanted to introduce you to is a young man who I was fortunate to meet when I worked at Hopkins a number of years ago. I met him in 2015. This young man is from Ferguson. He served time for drug charges, felony, went on to get an MBA, a PhD. I met him while he was a postdoc at Hopkins. He is now a professor at Howard University College of Medicine and Hopkins. But think about brilliant minds. He finished at the top of his class. But can you imagine if we had just tossed him away? Now, this is a very short video clip from him, and he has a nonprofit he's running from prison cells to PhD. But this is a brief story in his words of his story. But again, such a brilliant mind that would have just been tossed away because of past mistakes. The Supreme Court, we still have them, and I'll talk a little bit about that, how fees, paying for your bed, parole, etc. really can be devastating.
And they charge interest on what you
They do, and they can be devastating. They disproportionately target certain segments of our population. I saw one more hand up. Was it Sahar? No? Oh, no, Allison in the back. I didn't see your hand up. Sorry, Allison. There's a fantastic NPR investigative series that they did back in 2014 called Guilty and Charged. And they have all these little podcasts of people talking about being unable to, so if we want you to do community service, but you have to pay $100 to do that community service, if you can't pay that $100, guess what? Back to prison you go. People who were employed previously, having to go back to prison, you lose your job, you lose your housing, that woman lost her house, your livelihoods, your families, etc. And so it shows how things are stacked against you. In some states, they had a chart of how much different things cost, how much it costs for your food while you're in prison, your linen, your this, your that, the parole officer, and it's oftentimes the people who are imprisoned when they are released paying for those costs. What happens when they cannot? What it also talks about is, say if you get a traffic ticket and you can't afford to pay the traffic ticket, the subsequent fines and how they pile up. In this case, this woman lost her license and how that can end up with a prison stay. And let me give you, yeah, you've got the mic, go ahead, please do.
Yeah, I guess what I'm baffled by, sitting over here listening to all of this, is how are people ever going to have an opportunity to ever get ahead and get back into the stream of life and living and being a productive member of society? I don't know. It's like we're going backwards in time.
It's
It's
extreme.
like, it truly is like slavery.
Yep.
It is. I mean, that's what it is.
It's slavery by another name, and it's extremely difficult. I can tell you that every year, Housing and Urban Development does a point-in-time homelessness prevalence survey. I participated in the one in Baltimore, I think it was like 2015 with a dear friend of mine, and we had to interview people. So I interviewed 5 or 6 men, she interviewed 5 or 6 men. Sadly, of the 6 men I interviewed, 4 of them previously had records. Now that was not a question on the survey, and I'm like, oh my gosh, if we're not asking this question, how can we address this? One of the men, and it was so disheartening for me because we were the same age, he spent 20 years in prison, he had been out for 6 years, he's been homeless for 6 years. He's been unemployed for 6 years. So when, by the grace of someone or something, he hasn't gone back into the system, but if he does end up in the system, we're gonna hold it against him, hey, why couldn't you do better? So to your point, it's just so disheartening, heartbreaking, and we need to do better. We really need to do better. And I know Maya Angelou has a quote, which I'm going to butcher, but basically what she says is, once you know better, you try to do better, and we really, really need to do better. There's also this whole issue, and I'm sure Phil's going to talk about this, cash bail practices and bail reform. So when you are arrested, can you afford to pay bail? Some people basically, oh no, that person we know this person will show up, so that person can appear and doesn't have to pay bail. But it seems like those who are least likely to be able to afford bail are having to pay bail, have to pay a large amount of bail. You have to go through a bail bonds person, it could be 10%. So think of you if you already are low income and your bail is $10,000, right? Which most of us probably don't have a cool 10 grand lying around, but you've got to come up with $1,000, right? Well, you can't pay that, so we're going to keep you until trial.
There are like bail bondsmen that act as payday lenders. I mean, they're extremely high interest rates on that 10% that you have to put up. They'll put up the rest, but they'll lend you the 10% that you need because you got the 0, and you end up paying them just terrible.
And how can you possibly get ahead in that situation? So with the reform, obviously the bail bond industry is vehemently against it because that's their bread and butter, but we need to do better. We talked already in that whole school to prison pipeline forum. That completely feeds in what we're talking about, because if we start suspending our young people, I mean, there are fights. I just saw Chesapeake High School in Anne Arundel County had a racially charged fight the other day, but the kids in the fight were charged with second-degree assault. All of us probably remember when we were in high school, junior high, when people had a fight, was anyone charged with assault? No. So that's another step into the school to prison pipeline. And basically focusing more on restorative justice. There's also that whole issue of corruption. You heard about that particular district attorney. Well, it's not just district attorneys or whatever, but when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, this was talking about from school likelihood or from foster care to prison. And when we think about those women who are in prison and their kids, they are especially vulnerable. The issue of corruption, if you get a chance, there is a documentary about this, Kids for Cash. It was in Pennsylvania. We do not have privately owned prisons here in Maryland, but in Pennsylvania they do. 2 judges who were in the juvenile justice system, I see nodding heads, know what I'm talking about. Yes, basically we're taking kickbacks. a lot of money in kickbacks so they could keep those beds, prison beds filled. They finally were charged and convicted, and I think they themselves are doing like 15 and 22 years or something like that. But think of the lives that were ruined. This affected thousands of children. Several children committed suicide. If you get a chance in the documentary, they talk about a mom who used tough love on her son, who's like, yes, I'm gonna call the police, I'm gonna let him go through the system, maybe this will wake him up. Got caught up in that system and ended up committing suicide, and now she can't forgive herself. So we have a lot of work to do. So with that, I'm really excited to turn this over to Mr. Philip Kroom, because it's nice to talk about it, but now we need to know what can we actually do about this, and I know you're hungry for that information. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me initially say that Christopher is passing around a couple of handouts. One of them is about the group that I am working with called Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform. And on one side of the page it talks about the group, and on the reverse side of the page it talks about our sort of comprehensive approach to working in the state of Maryland. Our group is definitely focused on the state of Maryland. We're not dealing with national issues. We're beginning to deal with local issues. We had decided against making a focus on national issues because in the state of Maryland, all of our congressional delegation except one are Democrats and are in essence poised to vote the right way in terms of legislation on a federal level. The second piece of paper that's coming around is a few issues that I think could be of special concern and interest to you as Harford County residents. And I'll talk about them more in a moment. I know that from Christopher, your normal time you would like to finish is 5 o'clock, which is like 20, 25 minutes from now. So I'm going to rely to some extent on those written materials and try to hit the highlights. Again, but before I do, I need to add to the introduction so you kind of know where I'm coming from. I am someone who became a Quaker, which is meaningful in the sense that Quaker belief is that if you see something wrong and you have the opportunity to make it right, you should. You know, that there's not really a question there. It's kind of an obligation. At the same time that I was a Quaker, I was a prosecutor, trying to do a good job, which meant putting more people in jail or on probation. And then I later became involved in the juvenile court system and eventually became a judge at the top trial level in Anne Arundel County. Over those years, there was, I perceived, a conflict between being a prosecutor and a judge who was sentencing people to prison, and a Quaker who thought, you know, I should be doing the best thing that I can possibly do for these people to turn their lives around. It came to my attention early on that the recidivism rate in the state of Maryland when I was working was about 51%. That means of all the people that we sent to prison, 51% would be back in prison on a new charge within 3 years. So if you think about that, that means basically that sending people to prison was not rehabilitating them. If anything, it was guaranteeing that they were going to have a really hard time getting an honest job and doing something better with their lives. Over the course of time, I discovered was happening that they were cutting back the prison budget for education so that fewer people would be able to get GEDs, college degrees, fewer people would be able to get job training, They were cutting back the budgets on drug treatment, on mental health treatment. They were basically cutting all of the budgets for everything except housing. At the same time, I later found out, kind of to my dismay, through the Quaker meeting, our meeting made an arrangement with an African American church up the street from us to do a new Jim Crow book club that we shared. And that brought to my attention with great force that in the exact years when I had been working, the prison population in Maryland had tripled. And the amount of people under supervision in the criminal justice system had gone up even more than that. So again, by my personal Quaker beliefs, I had to do something about it. I attempted to do something about it through the court system, starting a statewide sentencing committee to review what judges could do to make sentences better and more fair. However, although we came up with a great report, the people in charge of implementing that potentially had a transition and it did not get implemented. So when the time came for me to decide if I was going to run for office again or take retirement instead of being in another election, I decided I was going to take retirement and spend more time doing things like this. The new Jim Crow Book Club morphed into Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform. The last chapter, if you've read the new Jim Crow Book Club, is what can you do about this? You know, and so we, in our discussion, said maybe we could form a group that would talk about how to reduce the number of people in prison and increase the amount of money that we had for drug treatment, education, mental health, etc. We came out with a proposal for a bill in 2014, and the legislators that we spoke to said, thank you very much, but we are not into task forces and things like that this year in 2014. However, as we left the room, with our heads hanging low, people from all over the room came to our group and said, that's a great idea. Can we work with you on that? And folks who came were from citizens groups in Baltimore City, from other churches, from the ACLU, from, I think from the public defender also, and so forth. And the result was we then had a group of people from all around the state, and we were able to make connections with people who had very good background, including the former director of parole and probation in the state, the former person who was in charge of all state prisons in the state. We eventually made contact with former Governor Ehrlich, who, although he is Republican, had one of the better records as governor in terms of criminal justice reform, perhaps because he was married to a former public defender, and she had his ear. At any rate, so that was how the group got started. So I should finish my introduction in that regard to say, although I still work part-time for the court system, I'm not speaking for them today, since they do not have official positions in favor of many of the things that I'm talking about, even though they ought to. On the flip side of one of the two handouts, which I'm hoping you have, the front says who we are and talks about it. It's an all-volunteer group. None of us is paid. The flip side on the back talks about 2018 legislative and policy initiatives. And what we realized at the outset was that although it may look like the problem is people getting sent to prison and so forth, and too many of them, that's almost the tip of the iceberg. And the other 90% of it is below the surface. The other 90% of it is who gets arrested, what happens immediately when they're arrested, like are they unable to make bail because even though it's a nonviolent offense and the bail is only $500, are they too poor to even pay $500? once they can't pay $500, are they stuck in the local jail waiting for their trial date? They haven't even been found guilty yet. But if they're there for 3 months or 4 or 6 months, they will have lost their job. They will, when they don't have a job, will have lost their place to live. If they lost their place to live, their family has been broken up. And if all of those things happen to you when you finally do get out, you are going to be in desperate straits. You're going to have a hard time getting a job because you now have a criminal record. And the only kind of work you probably can get might involve drugs, for example. So we talked about the front door. We talked about behind the walls, which includes trying to improve the correctional education job training system. Talked about the back door, what happens when someone is released. How do you help them try to get their life back on track instead of falling back into the old patterns again? And each year since 2015, we have offered different pieces of legislation, and we've had some amazing successes. We passed something called the Justice Reinvestment Act, which is a bill that was called a milestone in the newspapers and has been described by some of the legislators as the most important bill that they've ever participated in passing. What that bill did is it reduced the penalties for drug offenses by more than half. So that where previously you might have received 20 years, now you could receive less than 10. Where previously if you would have received 5 years, you can now receive only 18 months. And it also provided that various people who were already sentenced under the old law can file a request for reconsideration and reduce their sentences to what it would have been. And the law also provides that for all the people who are released, and it's not actually just drugs, it's other nonviolent offenses, property crimes, theft, also could have their sentences reduced. All of the money that is saved by reducing the prison population is going to go into a fund for drug treatment and diversion and mental health and other things that are needed. That system went into effect because it took them a long time to prepare, October 1st of 2017. And the money from the prison population will not be recognized until 2019. But even though it's taking a while, we believe that is a good first step that is going to eventually shrink our prisons and provide more funding for the right things. That said, there's still lots of things to do. One of them is the pretrial problem. People unable to make bail, therefore sitting in there even before they're found guilty. Many people will sit there and eventually have the charges dismissed against them or be found not guilty. And yet you sat there for months. Sometimes if you paid a bail bondsman, you don't get that money back. So you have this horrendous penalty, even if you were not guilty, etc. One thing that we participated in last year was we got the highest court in Maryland to change the rules about bail bondsmen, to say that bail should be like the last opportunity. If you have a pretrial release program, the judges are told to use the pretrial supervision program instead of putting someone on money bail. That was hotly opposed by the bail bondsmen. And in the legislature, they tried to cancel the rule out. The head of one of the key committees, a gentleman named Senator Bobby Zirkin from Baltimore County, was the second highest receiver of campaign contributions in the United States for any from bail bondsmen of any state legislator. Pretty amazing. In just a short number of years, he received more than $78,000. So he was leading the charge to undo that rule. And fortunately, we managed to stop that bill to cancel the rule in the last couple of days of sessions with assistance of the Speaker of the House. This year, a new bill had come out to try to create a system to expand pretrial supervision to all 24 jurisdictions in Maryland. Currently, I think it is only 13 jurisdictions in Maryland have pretrial supervision. The other 11 counties don't. Harford County is one that has pretrial supervision, but the second piece of that is the same bill that was offered this year also would provide something called pretrial risk screening. Pretrial risk screening is where you ask someone a short list of standardized questions and you check their record for prior offenses and recent failures to appear, and they come up with a score. And if the standardized test is validated, it has been arranged in some states and tested to be not racially discriminatory, regardless of the fact of if you come from Santana, Baltimore, where the policing and the arrest rate is 3 or 4 times as high. If it's a validated, standardized test, the difference between the scores that are produced for African Americans and white folks or Latino is within 1% or less. So that's a very good system that it's adopted. Currently in the state of Maryland, we have only 10 jurisdictions out of 24 that use risk screening. And of those